Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our session on the role of competition and labor policies in boosting wages. My name is Carmen Sanchez Cumming, and I am a research associate at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And it is my pleasure to be moderating today's session. Before we start, I will give a very brief preview of the presentations we will hear today and go through some quick housekeeping items. So first, we will hear from Benjamin Scuderi, who will be presenting Fighting for Talent, Equilibrium Wage Dispersion on a High-Wage Online Job Board. Then we will hear discussion remarks from Claudia Macaluso. Then Krista Ruffini will present minimum wages and employment composition. After that, Linh will present wage differentials and the price of workplace flexibility. These two presentations will be followed by discussion remarks by Bradley Setzler. Unfortunately, due to a scheduling error, Simon Mongi will no longer be able to present today. We will have between 10 and 15 minutes for each presentation and 15 minutes for each discussant. You may hear me giving verbal time checks during the presentation so that we don't run over. After the presentations, we will open the floor to audience questions and to a discussion. We really encourage questions from the audience. Please submit them into the Q&A box that you will see on your screen. And please include your name and affiliation when doing so. And with that, I will pass it on to Benjamin, who will kick us off with the first presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Carmen. Let me share my screen now. Wow, why am I? Sorry. There we go. Okay. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that now. As I said, thanks a lot, Carmen. Very excited to be here today to present my paper, which is joint with Nina Russil. And slides going. So just to start at a very, very high level, if you're somebody who studies labor markets or is interested in setting labor market policy, one thing you'll be interested in understanding is essentially what we call in this paper equilibrium wage dispersion, or another way to say that is inequality in wages across workers. And something that is reflected in data in a lot of different settings is that even conditional in a lot of worker characteristics, there's still a large variation in wages for workers with, as I said, the same characteristics when they work at different firms. And so in understanding what's driving wage inequality and policies, which policies might actually help to alleviate wage inequality, we kind of want to understand why this variation arises, why equilibrium wage dispersion happens. And in the labor literature, there's been a lot of potential reasons that have been given. So one is that it's just maybe unobserved productivity differences. One is that maybe it's compensating wage differentials across firms that differ in kind of how nice it is to work for those firms. Another kind of set of explanations is that actually it's these wage differentials are driven by labor market power, so monopsony power. And in reality, these three motives can all combine in different ways. But if you want to actually kind of separate out these factors, you typically are going to need to apply some strong assumptions to data that you have access to in labor markets to actually separate them out and kind of figure out what's driving wage dispersion. And a key ingredient, a key assumption that's often made in studies of labor market power and equilibrium wage dispersion are assumptions around what we call firm wage setting conduct, which you can just think of as how firms decide who they want to hire and how much they want to pay to those potential hires. So different assumptions around wage setting conduct are going to lead to different downstream implications for things like what markdowns look like relative to productivity, or whether or not compensating differentials arise and how those compensating differentials arise. So most studies are going to assume a single mode of conduct on the part of employers, and then just use that assumption to help separate out these factors. What our study does is to combine some novel data from a large online job board for tech workers with some tools from the industrial organization literature to understand firm behavior and wage setting on a particular labor market. So just to step back a little bit and give you kind of a basic framework to think about the study and the importance of conduct assumptions, I'll just provide a very simple example. And the example here, what we should think of is we have data for a single labor market. And in that labor market, we have a single employer. So very simple. And what we're assuming we can see about this labor market are two things. So one is the equilibrium kind of level of employment and wages. That's the point ET that I've marked out. And we're also assuming that what we know is the labor supply curve. So that's the curve that's marked LS of T. What we don't know is we don't know productivity. Okay. So now let's imagine we wanted to make an inference about the marginal productivity of labor, how productive workers are. Well, one thing we might do is we might assume that even though there's a single employer in this labor market, we might assume that that employer is acting as if it's facing kind of perfect competition. And in that case, it would set wages equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. So under that content assumption, you just simply kind of draw horizontally across from the point ET, mark that off on the y-axis, and then that's your inference for what productivity is in that labor market. But of course, the single employer in this setting, we might think that that single employer could actually be acting as a more classical labor market monopsonist. And in that case, what the monopsonist would do is it won't set productivity equal to the wage equal to productivity. It'll set wages equal to something called the marginal, it'll set wages such that the productivity is equal to the marginal cost of labor. And without getting too much into the specifics, the marginal cost of labor curve is something you can derive if you know the labor supply curve. That second curve that I added, it's always above the labor supply curve. And so to infer what productivity must be in this market, under that assumption, you just simply draw up from the current level of employment, find where that is in the marginal cost of labor curve, draw across, and you've inferred productivity. So the point of this simple illustration is just to say that with the same data, two different assumptions about how firms are setting wages will lead to two very different conclusions about what productivity looks like in this market, and therefore different conclusions about what policies might be relevant and what kind of equity and efficiency looks like in this market. So in our paper, what we do is we essentially do that analysis, but in a kind of very detailed way on a particular labor market. Don't have time to go through everything. There's a lot of details that I encourage. If you're interested in pain, you can go read the paper. But the basic framework is that first we estimate labor supply to get essentially the labor supply curve from that first figure. And we have using the novel data that we have on this job board, we think we can kind of cleanly and flexibly estimate and model workers' preferences over firms. And what's important here is to capture both what we call horizontal differentiation and vertical differentiation. So vertical differentiation is simply that some firms are just on average better to work for, nicer to work for than others. And horizontal differentiation is kind of idiosyncratic variation in preferences for working at the same firm across different workers. And that second form of variation is what's going to drive the potential for market power, firms to exert market power in this market. What we then do is we then use, again, the special structure of our labor market and the data we have to estimate a range of models of labor demand. And so this is where firm conduct assumptions come into play. And then we specify a testing procedure to adjudicate between those different models using an exclusion restriction. So to give a little bit more detail about what the different conduct assumptions that we're thinking about are, we're going to actually go ahead and estimate 5 different models of labor demand under these different assumptions. And without getting too in the weeds, I'll try to have a high-level discussion of what they are here. So the first is a baseline perfect competition model. And essentially, there's basically just one way to be perfectly competitive, and that's to set wages equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. So that's our first assumption, our first model. Once you move away from perfect competition into imperfect competition, there's a number of ways, and a huge number of ways to be imperfectly competitive for frictions to arise in the market. So we're testing 4 models of imperfect competition, but we're not necessarily thinking that these are all the possible models of imperfect competition. These are some important models we'd like to test, and hopefully people can pick this up and think about maybe using this testing procedure to test other kind of flavors of imperfect competition in other markets. But in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to take combinations of 2 kind of sets of alternatives. So the first set of alternatives has to do with what we can think of as the perceived competitive environment of the firms. And that's really how firms see themselves perceive themselves relative to the competition when they're setting wages. So the first option is what we call, and is often called, monopsonistic competition. And that's essentially where firms kind of think of themselves as small relative to the market. And if you work out the math, what it leads to is near uniform markdowns across firms. So firms are setting wages equal to basically the same share of marginal revenue product across firms. An alternative to that model is what we'll call oligopsony, which is where firms kind of correctly perceive their size relative to the competition. And what that leads to is a model where markdowns will vary more across firms, and markdowns, essentially all else equal, firms that have more valuable amenities where workers are more kind of excited to work will have the ability to mark down wages more than firms that have less valuable amenities. So that's a way in which this contract assumption can lead to compensating differentials in wage setting. And so these two versions of wage setting models, or these two assumptions, have been adopted by different papers at different times in the literature. So this isn't just kind of a totally abstract idea. There's actually different papers that take, either side of this assumption. The other set of assumptions or alternatives we'll think about have to do with how offers might be tailored to different workers. And so essentially, you can think of this as price discrimination. In our model of preferences, workers have observable characteristics that might be correlated with kind of their taste for working at particular firms. And essentially, we're going to ask whether firms take that into account or whether they ignore that in formulating their wage bids for workers. So the first thing I'd just like to show is essentially the empirical version of that example, that different assumptions about wage setting conduct indeed drive very different conclusions about the size of markdowns in this labor market. So in blue, I've plotted the distribution of markdowns under monopsonistic competition for the wage bids in our sample. And in red, I've plotted the same distribution, but under the oligopsony assumption. What you can see is that under monopsonistic competition, we're going to conclude that markdowns are smaller on average, but also less variable. And then under oligopsony, we're going to conclude that, higher average markdowns, but also much more variability and a much thicker tail of very large markdowns. So the difference on average is monopsonistic competition leads to about an 18% markdown, whereas oligopsony leads to about a 26% markdown of wages relative to the marginal revenue product. So big differences. And again, without getting into too many of the technicalities, the idea of our testing procedure is to say, if we can find a variable that we think is correlated with preferences, but not productivity, then what we can do is we can basically take a productivity equation from each model, estimate that, collect the residuals from those productivity equations, and ask whether those residuals are correlated with this instrument. To the extent those residuals are correlated with the instrument, that suggests kind of a model misspecification because that instrument shouldn't be correlated with productivity, it should be uncorrelated. So what we see here is, again, just for the two models I plotted above, doing that visual version of that test, where in red, we've plotted the kind of bin scattered correlation between the instrument and the residuals. And you can see there's a pretty robust negative correlation, whereas under the monopsonistic competition model, there's a much smaller correlation. So that's going to lead us to prefer monopsonistic competition as a model of wage setting in this market relative to oligopsony. So when we do the full version of the test on everything, we're going to find that we prefer monopsonistic competition without price discrimination as kind of a preferred model of wage setting. But every model of imperfect competition will way outperform the perfect competition baseline. So we can pretty strongly conclude that firms are exercising some form of market power in this market. Okay, so I'm about done. One thing that we get out of this, I'm talking about understanding wage dispersion and equilibrium and kind of how we want to interpret variation in wages. One thing that's important to think about is whether or not there are indeed compensating differentials. So are firms that have high pay, are firms that have low pay on average have kind of better amenities, so they compensate workers, or is pay and non-wage amenities correlated such that actual kind of utility dispersion, variation, inequality in well-being is greater than inequality in just wages. And what we see is actually fairly similar to some work results from Lorenzo Lagos's work, which is that it's a somewhat complicated story, but there's some evidence for compensating differentials at the bottom of the productivity distribution. So as as productivity increases from the very lowest productivity firms to about the bottom third, amenity values of those firms kind of decrease, and here pay and productivity are essentially move one-to-one. But then above that level, we find augmenting differences where pay and amenity values move together. So that's just one out of many things that we get out of this model that we can now say more about what equity and efficiency look like in this market. But I think I'm pretty much out of time. So just to conclude, I hope that I've convinced you that conduct assumptions play a critical role in shaping our conclusions about equity and efficiency in labor markets. In our paper, we show that it's possible to test these conduct assumptions in labor markets in the same way that IO economists might do in product markets. And we're hoping to kind of spur others to think about how we might test conduct in other market settings where different forms of conduct might prevail. Specific to our market, we're going to find that, even though this is a high wage labor market, even though it's an online platform that's designed to reduce frictions, we're still going to find that firms exert significant market power. So 18% markdowns are still fairly large. And so if monopsony matters on this market, it probably matters even more everywhere else. Okay, so thank you so much and appreciate your feedback.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. Now we're going to hear some discussion remarks from Claudia.
Can you see the slides? Yes. So I know everyone says, thank you so much for letting me discuss this paper, but I truly mean it. This was, for a paper about matching and interviewing, a perfect match. It's a really, really nice exercise, and it sort of intersects with a lot of my interests. So well done. I really enjoyed reading the paper. My comments will actually be organized, so to speak, on one of the nicest features of this paper, which is sort of this cross-pollination between macro labor and IO, and I will come from the macro labor side. So you'll see that sort of coming strongly to some extent. And I think that's a comment into itself. The paper has a lot of details, and I think to some extent there's a sense in which you want to choose your audience. So you'll see sort of if my comments are particularly sort of bothersome to you, perhaps I am not the right audience. Super quick summary. This paper tackles a very important question. Is the labor market perfectly competitive? And you may surmise that the answer is, well, no. But they go a little bit deeper than that, and they ask, what form of imperfect competition prevails? And they look at pretty much two models: classical monopsony with no strategic interaction and oligopsony. And then they add on top of that wage discrimination, which comes out of the fact that firms don't quite observe the type, but they observe a signal of the workers' type. So they might be able, to offer different contracts to different types of workers. Long story short, this paper says it's classical monopsony and no wage discrimination. And this may sound small, but it's actually huge because it rules out a whole class of models, including some that have been used very recently to estimate markdowns. So it's a really important result. And these sort of is what they call conduct, these sort of environments. How do they do this? My sense is that, one, they have really in sort of particularly detailed data that, whenever I see a paper like this, I always think how did you get this? But maybe this is a story for another day. They also are very careful in sort of positing their exclusion restriction. This is a paper where the data and the econometric assumptions really go together, and they're very carefully put together. And finally, they adapt very cleverly a statistical test in the literature that has a beautiful interpretation that is akin to goodness of fit. Basically, whichever sort of model fits the data, the raw data best, that's the one that we are able to say is the truth, so to speak. And I think that's really nice because it's intuitive, and you don't always find such intuitive criteria. So I really appreciated that. Now, these three things that are the strengths of the paper are also the places where the paper sort of has some issues. And that's in the sense that the fact that the data is so special, it makes it also rare to find, rare to replicate. So my comments would be sort of organized on these 3 topics. I will not say much about the test because it's actually just really interesting and good. I will have a few words for how to sort of think of the data and how to think of the exclusion restrictions. But broadly speaking, I'm going to go from large to small. So big picture. The paper has a very macro labor motivation, as you heard. It's about why are workers that are otherwise similar paid differently, to sort of paraphrase Mortensen. And they go at it, however, with a very IO jargon and a very IO industrial organization technique. And so the first thing that we encounter is conduct. This is not something that I was particularly familiar with. So it took me some time to understand what conduct is. And conduct is kind of like in between wage setting and hiring behavior. It's a mix of both, but it doesn't, for example, really speak to interviewing behavior. Is there an interview anyway? That's taken for granted. So I think I would appreciate a little bit of a discussion of why this particular definition of conduct. In fact, if you would like to do so, I would find it useful to make explicit contact with the matching function literature. Because your paper has some pieces of information that literature would find very interesting. In particular, your paper has evidence that matching is non-sequential. The kind of labor market that you're looking at doesn't look like firm goes out with like a piece of paper with a wage, posting that wage, and bumps into workers. First one is no good, second one is no good, third one is good, and here match. Actually, it looks like firm goes out, looks at candidate, collects possible, candidates, and then sort of does something to screen and potentially hires. That's a very different mechanism than most actually macro labor models. I think you could say something on that. Your paper may also have explicit implication on bargaining protocol, which is the bit that happens after the bid in your data. And I wonder if you could say something. Specifically, there's a literature on, do we have, bargaining protocol a la Cahook et al., where from outside offers, workers are able to renegotiate. Your paper has some of that because of these reservation wage that you guys have in the data. But it doesn't quite break it out, and I think it would be very valuable. As you said, conduct affects the magnitude of markdowns, and possibly in a large way. But I'm still in that Cahook and Postel-Vinay world, and I'm thinking, well, so do like a ton of other things. It comes out from the paper that you guys think and have reason to believe this is first order. I would really love a discussion, even a short one of that. And in fact, you could do that by taking those models that you were citing, Berger et al., Bradley's work, and identifying exactly where is conduct here, where is the thing I define as conduct. And if you feel like so inclined, I think a missing piece of conduct, so to speak, is in fact the screening behavior. Because you have here the wage setting and then the hiring, but really there's this in between in which I put out a bid. So I post a wage, something happens, and maybe I decide to do match or not. And it looks like you could put that into conduct as well. Some firms do a lot of interviews, some firms don't. Just think of the academic, labor market, how different it is from other labor markets. So what about the data? I told you this data is really impressive. It is impressive because it has a tremendous amount of detail, and specifically some pieces we never see otherwise. But there is a trade-off between detail and external validity. This is not typical to your paper, Ben. It's to be honest, in very many of these papers. So Hire.com is a platform for techies. So it's really about engineers in San Francisco. Nothing against them, they're really nice people, but this is sort of what we are looking at. And for the contacts that are initiated on the platform, we do see an incredible level of detail. You see, for example, the full offer set, not just the equilibrium matches. And that's something that, as a sort of labor economist, really got me excited, and a host of other things. But obviously, matches also happen outside the platform. In particular, I didn't really get a sense of how big the platform is for this type of matches, even this specific labor market. Is Hire.com 80% of the matches? How many of them happen outside? In fact, is Hire.com kind of a complement to other recruiting channels. There's quite a bit of evidence that networks are very important, especially in high skill recruiting. So how does that work? Do I look someone up on hire.com because my previous employee told me, or because, I don't know, my boss told me or whatever? Another thing that I couldn't quite wrap my head around is, who exactly is hiring here? You call them firms. In my head, being the census data nerd, I first was like, with firms or establishing, what are we doing here? Or maybe businesses, employers, maybe jobs. I think a clarification would be really helpful. In a similar vein, you guys observe the wage ask. This is the wage that the worker would like to receive, and they post on their profile, and the wage bid, which is the counterpart. The firm comes in and says, hey, I'm willing to pay this much. Would you like to interview? But I couldn't quite think, how do those two things relate to more boring, perhaps, concepts such as reservation wage and surplus? What kind of wage is this anyway? And I think all I'm saying here is I am thinking through a wage posting model, and maybe I shouldn't to some extent. So that's the sense in which, is this really the audience you want? Maybe you want me to think in terms of auctions and prices, not in terms of reservation wages. So there's this disconnect a little bit. So about sort of this bidding system, what happens in this platform is kind of, it's really sort of hysterical, because what happens is it's employers bidding for candidates, and candidates reveal their desired wage and firms bid accordingly. And Ben and Nina showed that the firms bid very close to the desired wage, and indeed also the realized wage is very close. So there's a sense in which that is a measure of reservation wage and surplus, but we don't really know which one. But then that really got me thinking, and I thought, well, then instead of why are similar workers paid differently, which is because they have a different reservation wage, we should ask, why do similar workers have different reservation wages? Why do the similar workers actually put a different ask wage? And to some extent, this is because the model you're writing and the paper you're writing is not really about matching. It's about recruiting. And that's really interesting, because recruiting is a huge black box. We don't really know what happens, between application and hire. We call it a matching function, but who knows, right? And the point, that's a bit of a cheap comment, but I have to say is this is a very specialized labor market. The motivation is very aggregate, but the application is somewhat sort of restricted. So I would appreciate a discussion of that. I also want to stress that the fact that specialized doesn't make it any less valuable. There's just a disconnect between sort of the intro and the rest of the paper to some extent. Let me see how much time do I have? Oh, I have a few more minutes. So let me sort of zoom in a little bit on the exclusion restrictions. There are 3 of them that you should really care about. 2 of them are econometric assumptions, I like to call them like that, and 1 is sort of economic. The econometric ones amount on restrictions on information. The first one, it says that conditional on these revealed characteristics that the workers puts out on their profile, the probability of an employer bid is then independent of the true workers type. Loosely speaking, you can't see that worker type, so it doesn't matter. But I would argue that you cannot see it on the platform, but could you somewhere else? And if you think that the small labor market we're looking at, the engineers in the Bay Area, has a lot of repeated interactions, perhaps, Gregory Irish wouldn't agree, but I do argue that people do cycle between Microsoft and Google, then that would perhaps contradict this assumption. It's something worth thinking of. I suspect it's going to introduce some kind of bias, not sort of, but you could bind it and bound it and see sort of like how that works out. And the second assumption is that conditional on the type, on the other hand, the revealed characteristics do not predict the worker preferences. And this is a bit of a digression, but there's a lot of discussion of what is a worker type anyway. And I wonder if you could make contact with that literature. I put here a reference, and in that paper, there's a lot of other references if you are curious. And perhaps this is a different paper, but just to expand. One last word on the economic assumption. the key part is that the labor market tightness on the platform isn't correlated with the firm idiosyncratic valuations, but it is not correlated with the market ounce. So it's going to sort of shift the market ounce, but not the bids. And the way the labor market tightness is defined here is applicants and job openings or requests really in these experience, occupation, and 2 weeks period bin. That's what a labor market is. So maybe I'm not thinking about this super clearly, but wouldn't macro shocks actually affect this? Because you have these labor market outside the platform. And that's going to do something, potentially to change the value of a match, and potentially also influence the tightness on the platform. I actually have no idea if people search more or less online at different places of the cycle, but that's something that I would like to see addressed. And then a teeny thing is, you have a good argument for why 2 weeks seems sensible in your context. I've seen a couple of papers, a couple of data points. So some from the DHI hiring indicator, some work we've done at Richmond Fed with the survey of employer recruiting behavior, the SERB, that sort of really compresses that to a week, especially for high tech. So it'd be nice to see perhaps a discussion of that, perhaps a little robustness. These are just sort of things that when you want to write your next paper after this one, maybe you can think of these passive recruiting, the idea of firms are just sort of checking out people for the future, not just for now. That's also something that comes out very strongly, especially in this tight labor market and with a record number of job openings. It seems like if you go the auction route, then you could be interested in talking about the cost of the platform, the cost of an interview, really. I'm sure there are platform fees, and how does that interact with the bid for different sizes of firm, for example. To conclude, because I think I am over time already, if it were my paper, I would make contact with macro labor more explicitly. Or I would actually ditch macro labor altogether and make it a paper about an auction that is really well estimated with really cool data. And the second one might be sort of more feasible. Notice that I didn't say anything about your gender stuff and your welfare stuff, and I did that on purpose. There's a lot in this paper, and I feel like it could be made cleaner. That's true of, I think, 100% of papers out there. So it's not sort of necessarily about this paper. I would think about the implication of off-platform matches for this very same market and discuss external validity a little bit more. And then I would submit it, and you're going to publish it really well because it's really enjoyable work and definitely something that sort of fills a need in the literature. So I think it's going to be great, and I look forward to see how it evolves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Claudia. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Wonderful comments. I really appreciate it all.
And next, Krista, whenever you're ready.
Great. Thanks so much, Carmen, for including our work on the program. So this is joint work with Ashwin Gandhi at UCLA. And in this project, we are taking as a starting point the very large literature in labor economics that finds that as a whole, minimum wage increases tend to have limited disemployment effects on low-wage labor markets. Yet at the same time, when these reforms don't change the overall number of workers, they do change worker flows in and out of the labor force. So in particular, when the minimum wage increases, we see reductions in hiring and we see reductions in separation. So in this project, we want to dig more into the distributional effects of minimum wages and examine whether these aggregate changes have any differential changes on the types of workers that are working more or fewer hours and which types of workers are more or less likely to be retained by their employer. And when we're thinking about how workers might differ, there's a whole variety of characteristics that workers differ along. And we're going to be focusing on this in this project on differences by firm-specific worker experience. We're going to be asking this question in the context of the US nursing home sector. US nursing homes are a very interesting setting to explore this question because it's a very labor-intensive sector where many of the direct care staff receive pretty low wages. So our focal occupation is going to be certified nursing assistants, or CNAs. So on a given day, every single resident in a nursing home receives about 2 hours of direct person-to-person care from these CNAs. These workers tend to receive fairly low wages. Their median pay is about $14 an hour during our analysis period. This is very similar to what we see amongst other workers that are affected by minimum wages in the retail sector. And this is very difficult work. These CNAs are responsible for assisting residents with activities of daily living, or things that we all do on a day-to-day basis, things like mobility, cleaning, toileting, eating, etc. There's also limited scope for career advancement. Working as a CNA tends to be these workers' careers. And like other low-wage industries, turnover amongst these workers is very high, with recent estimates saying annual turnover is greater than 100%. Now, much of this turnover is going to be within the industry. That is, if a CNA leaves his or her employer, they're often going to work as a CNA for the nursing facility down the street. There's very limited transitions to either credentialed nurses or other occupations. We're going to be examining how minimum wages affect this labor market over a 3-year period from the end of 2016 through the end of fiscal year 2019. And during this period, there was no change in the federal minimum wage, but we have really rich variation at the state and local level in minimum wage changes. So these plots are showing on the x-axis the minimum wage in the base year, either 2017 or 2018. And then on the y-axis, the minimum wage in the following year, either 2018 on the left, 2019 on the right. And what you should take away from these figures is there's a lot of variation in the baseline minimum wages. So some facilities are going to be subject to the federal minimum of $7.25 an hour, and other locations like Los Angeles, Seattle have a minimum wage of $15 an hour. And then the changes in the minimum wage happen at all the points of the distribution. So we see some areas that started from relatively low baseline wages, around $8 an hour, increasing their minimums. But we also see changes in the Los Angeleses and Seattles of the world that started from these relatively high levels and then increased their minimum even further. And finally, if we focus on the distance between the circle centroid and the dotted line, we also see that there's variation in the size of minimum wage changes. So compared to the historical setting, this past 3-year period is a period where minimum wage changes are pretty modest in scale. So the median change that we're looking at is about 62 cents an hour, and we don't have any changes that are greater than $2 an hour. Our data, which I'll get to in a second, have really rich individual level data on the number of hours worked. But one shortcoming of these data are that we don't have a great measure, or really any measure, of worker pay. And I mentioned earlier that CNAs receive about $14 an hour, which is higher than the statutory minimum in most settings. So they're going to be workers that are likely affected through the spillover effects of minimum wages. And so really, to see how minimum wages are affecting this labor force, we want to be focusing on the areas for which the minimum wage is most binding. So in order to get at the sample of counties, we're going to construct this pay ratio term using data on nursing home wages from the QCEW and OES. And so this pay ratio term is going to estimate the number of hours that a worker would have to work at the statutory minimum wage in order to receive wages that are going to be similar to what a CNA might be expected to earn in these areas. And we're going to be focusing on facilities that are in the bottom 2 wage quintiles. We're also going to be restricting our sample to facilities that are in local labor markets in which there's many firms operating. And this is to make sure that we're not conflating any changes that a monopsonist might have with those that are occurring in labor market areas that are closer to perfect competition, where we have many different facilities competing for labor. The data that we use to look at how minimum wages are affecting the hours allocation amongst nursing home workers comes from payroll-based journal microdata. These data provide us with daily shift level data for all nursing home workers on an individual basis. So in total, we have about 9 million employer-employee relationships over about 1.7 billion shifts. The data span from the fourth quarter of 2016 through the third quarter of 2019. We intentionally exclude the pandemic from these analyses, just given all of the changes that occurred in the long-term care setting in the past 2 years. And importantly, this is auditable payroll-based data, so it provides us with a very precise measure of hours worked. It also provides us on information on who worked on a particular day, what role they were working as. Were they working as a CNA, an LPN, an RN, and were they employed as a wage employee, a salaried employee, or employed through an outside contract agency. And then for looking at how minimum wages affect workers of different types, we're going to focus on employee firm-specific experience defined as terciles of the hours worked as of the start of each fiscal year. And we do this for fiscal year 2018 and 2019 in order to be able to calculate the previous hours that these workers have worked. So one important contribution of this project is we have this really precise measure of hours worked that allows us to overcome some of the challenges in the existing minimum wage work that rely on household surveys, where rounding error in that number of hours worked can lead to division bias and these spurious null results. So in contrast, our data show a very wide distribution in the weekly hours worked. We do see some clustering around 35 hours, around 40 hours, but in general, there's some workers that are working very few hours. About a third of workers are working part-time, and about a third of workers are working at least some overtime hours. Okay. So when we're thinking about evaluating the effects of higher minimum wages, one thing that's important to keep in mind is minimum wage changes occur throughout the year in different areas. So for example, California might hypothetically increase their minimum wage on October 1st. New Jersey might do it on January 1st. And so our standard ways of dealing with this and two-way fixed effects designs are going to be implicitly comparing the counties that were recently treated, that is, had recent minimum wage increases, to those that just increased their minimum wage. And so we're going to be using the average treatment on the treated group time estimator proposed by Callaway and Santana, which really just gets back to the basics in terms of the building blocks of our two-way fixed effects design. So we're only going to be comparing the counties that had a minimum wage change on a specific date with those counties that don't have a minimum wage change. And we do this for all of the 2x2 time periods that we can think of. And then we aggregate the 2x2s into an overall ATT-GT, which you can think of as analogous to the standard diff and diff or two-way fixed effect estimator, as well as dynamic approaches, which are going to be more similar to an event study design. So first, we want to show how higher minimum wages are affecting overall employment in this sector to examine whether or not the findings of the previous literature are limited by rounding of errors. And the important thing to take away from this table is we don't see any significant disemployment effects, either when we measure employment as weekly hours per bed or the number of workers per bed. If anything, there's an increase in the number of hours worked by CNAs who are paid an hourly wage. Now, when we disaggregate this overall effect into bins of firm-specific employee experience, we don't see any changes in the number of hours that are worked by new hires, but amongst those that have at least some firm-specific experience in the first, second, and third tercile, we see increases in the number of hours worked by these workers for 6 months after a minimum wage increase. And so this begs the question, are these increases in hours by the most experienced workers? Is this due to the number of workers that have high levels of experience or the number of hours that each individual worker is working? And when we look at retention, we see that the reduction in separations occurs for all terciles of the experience distribution, but is particularly pronounced for those that have the greatest levels of firm-specific experience. So we can disaggregate that overall change in hours worked into estimates that include the retention effect and those that are just measuring the number of hours worked per retained worker. When we look at those with relatively low levels of firm-specific experience, we see the changes really being driven by the individual workers working more. But higher up the experience distribution, the retention effect is swamping any effect of individual worker hours. So at the very top of the experience distribution, all of the change is really coming through this greater retention effect. We kind of getting back into the individual worker considerations, we also want to see whether there's changes in certain types of work to see whether or not minimum wages are going to be changing the nature of low wage work. And what we see across the experience distribution is all types of workers become more likely to work some level of positive hours, but the relatively inexperienced workers are gravitating towards part-time roles, whereas those with the highest levels of experience are more likely to be employed in full-time positions. So all of the results that I showed thus far are really focused on these short-term effects. And if we think about the effects of minimum wages, we might expect that the effect in the long run is even greater in the short run, because firms that have higher retention today are also likely to have higher retention tomorrow. And as workers gain this firm-specific experience, they also become less likely to separate from their firm. So we take our reduced form estimates and we iteratively simulate how a $1 increase in the minimum wage would change the retention and hours allocation over the long term. And what we see is as we move further and further past the initial minimum wage change, the distribution in the hours work in the worker hours worked is shifted towards the right. So there's more and more hours being worked by workers that have high levels of firm-specific experience. And in the long term, the share of care hours that residents receive from workers with at least 1 year of full-time, full-year work increases by about 8 percentage points from a baseline of 56%. So this is a meaningful increase in the level of experienced care that residents are receiving. So just to wrap up, we find that higher minimum wages are shifting the allocation of hours to more experienced workers due to two factors. First, there's increased retention amongst the most experienced workers. And second, there's also increases in full-time work amongst the most experienced workers, whereas less experienced workers are more likely to work in part-time positions. And then finally, when we're thinking about the broader considerations for welfare and for society, it's also important to note that consumers are expected to benefit from receiving care from this more experienced workforce. So thanks so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Krista. Linh, whenever you're ready.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button after I shared my screen. Okay. So, all right, great. Right. Thanks everyone for being part of this session. This paper is joint with Marsha Drake, excellent student at Boston University on the job market, and Neil Tabra at Brown University. So, this paper is mostly about compensating differentials, a theme that we heard earlier today. And the idea of compensating differentials dates back to Adam Smith. It's not new. It says that all else equal, workers need to be compensated in wages for taking on a disamenity in the workplace. So while this is commonly discussed throughout the literature, just how important compensating differentials are in the labor market is really, really difficult to capture. And I think Brad and Ben can speak to this a little bit, given how complex the models are in their papers in order to do this. So the difficulty here is because the market of job amenities is not a separate independent market that we can observe. It's bundled with wages, nor can we observe workers' values of these amenities. So most of the time, we also see a pretty robust fact that it's actually the high wage workers who tend to also have better workplace amenities. So it's very hard to say that they are being compensated for taking on a disamenity here. So it's not that surprising that there's very little work discussing kind of the distribution of things, which workers actually have good amenities, not just on average. Do they value these amenities? Are the ones who have the amenities the one who values them? And how does it change over the wage distribution or the skill distribution? The answer is important for both our understanding of models of compensating differentials, but also for understanding rents and its sources. So in this paper, we're going to focus on one particular class of workplace amenities, which is workplace flexibility. Needless to say, during the pandemic, there has been a lot of discussions, in particular about working from home. And Nick Bloom and his co-authors have been carrying out these broad-scale surveys with 30,000 responses, carrying over the different months during and after the pandemic. This is one such figure from their work here. So looking across kind of the income distribution, you see the steep slope of the fact that it's the high wage workers who tend to be able to work from home more. But the slope for whether they actually value working from home more or not is a lot more flat. So the gap between employee design in black and employer supply is a lot larger at the lower end of the income distribution. So this is kind of the gap that we care about and we want to explain. Also a little bit different from Ben's paper, focusing on firms and whether firms come with some amenities. Here we're motivated by the fact that even within firms, there's unequal distribution of workplace flexibility. At a university, faculty members may have a lot better amenities or flexibility than members of the administrative staff. So the Council of Economic Advisors had several reports on workplace flexibility, and this is long before the pandemic, because this has been an important issue. We want to know whether there's scope for policy interventions. So they survey firms and workers, and they see that a lot of firms are able to provide flexibility to some workers, but very few firms can provide flexibility for all of its workers. So the next thing we also follow from the CA report is the fact that even within the class of workplace flexibility, there are different types of flexibility, and the distinction will turn out to be very important. So we're going to do the three types that the CA report covers. One is the ability to work from home that we just mentioned, which is flexible location. The extreme would be, do you have to work on site, or can you always choose to work from a remote location? Flexible schedule, which is even though you have to work 40 hours a week, you may be able to allocate those 40 hours in the more early morning or late at night or weekends and so forth. Or you have to do 9 to 5. Flexible total number of hours is yet a different dimension, which is that you may not have to work 40 hours a week, even though it's a full-time job. Some weeks you may want to just work part-time. This is the case, say, in pharmacy that Claudia Golden has been talking about a lot. The ability that pharmacists can always just reduce the hours, even if they're working full-time. So what are we going to do in this paper is to kind of link the three pieces here. One is we need to know whether workers value these amenities. And we want to know it at a very quantitative level, not just how many days they want, but how much wages are they willing to give up in order to gain one of these types of amenities. So we're going to be measuring that, and that's very challenging. That's the one thing I'm going to note here. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we need to do some form of very dynamic, adaptive experimentation here in order to measure the willingness to pay at the individual level. So we're contributing a little bit of a new piece of data here on our own. And then we're going to connect that to, okay, so of the workers who value amenity, if they value the amenities more, do they have those amenities? And the answer is yes. So if you value an amenity, it does mean that you're going to go and obtain it and you're going to be willing to pay for it. But if you look along the income distribution, it's very, very different. The fact is, we're going to see that wage is actually not predictive of willingness to pay, meaning it's like in the Nick Bloom figure, it's not that the high wage workers like amenities more or the low wage workers like amenities. We all want flexibility, roughly equally. But wage is very, very predictive of having amenities. So along the income distribution, the degree of sorting changes a lot. And this is what we want to explain. And this sorting also differs on what types of amenities, the flexibility it is. That's why it's important to distinguish between the three types. So roughly speaking, relative to the literature, we add this kind of broader set of data for willingness to pay at the individual level. So we can speak to inequality, but we also have new ingredient to talk about models of labor market equilibrium. So how do we do this? In practice, we go and collect this data ourselves. The two pieces that are easy to collect are wages. You can just, this is something that a lot of surveys do, direct question, how much do you earn? You can also ask, whether you have the ability to work from home or not. But it's harder to say how much are you willing to trade off in wages in order to get amenities. And usually people do discrete choice experiments, which we follow as well, but we do a dynamic version of this in order to gain the most efficiency possible and get this at an individual level. Our current samples is 1,800 workers on an online platform, Prolific. It's a pretty representative sample. We checked this compared to CPS, and it's widely used. And ultimately, if we care about the marginal worker, the fact that this is a broad range distribution is good enough for us to capture the marginal worker. So a discrete choice experiment, in order to kind of capture how much are you willing to forego wages in order to get an amenity, this is what the literature does, and we follow as well, which is asking people to make kind of explicit choices between bundles of jobs, like a job with higher wage but less flexibility, or a job with lower wage but with more flexibility. And the difference in the wages offered will kind of help you infer something about how much they must value these amenities. And you just ask these questions multiple times to the same workers. And if you can do this dynamically and efficiently with very, very few of such questions, you can kind of capture very precisely how much exactly each worker values each of these amenities. So that's what we do. So this is the data that we contribute in terms of willingness to pay for the three types of flexibility that I mentioned. The first one is flexible location. So in all three types, what we see is a very, very skewed with a big right tail distribution here. Because a lot of workers don't value the flexibility a lot. They're not gonna, give up any of their wages in order to have this, but a tail of workers value this a lot. So like any distribution assumption, like people assuming normal distribution or logit distribution will not capture this. This is pretty much a log normal. And our raw estimates is in the histogram, but even if we do a shrinkage to account for the fact that there is some noise at the individual level, the shrinkage distribution doesn't look that much different because our estimates are very precise. So it is indeed a log normal distribution. So we capture the fact that there's a right tail means that the fact that not many workers have these amenities could mean that firms are actually getting the implied price of paying for these amenities can actually be quite high. This is the case for flexible schedule as well. The value for these amenities are a little bit smaller. On average, it's about 9%, but the fraction of workers having these amenities is also lower. So the fact that faculty members have flexible schedule is highly valuable here. So flexible total number of hours, a lot of workers value it. It's very similar to flexible schedule, the ability to sometimes work fewer hours in some weeks and sometimes in some other weeks work more hours. In terms of the relationship between the three pieces, this is the first relationship between willingness to pay and whether you actually have the amenity or not. So we call this sorting by willingness to pay. So willingness to pay is on the x-axis. So as you value these amenities more, you tend to have them because you're willing to pay for them. Then if there's one market price, you're going to tend to be willing to pay for that price and obtain the amenity. So this is not surprising. This is as we would expect. It is a little bit different when we look across the wage distribution. So we do ask people what their wages are, and so the x-axis here on both figures are wages. You're going from the low end of the distribution up to pretty high wage workers are included here as well. So we see that wages on the left is very, very predictive of having an amenity. So for flexible location, that's a positive relationship. High wage workers tend to also have the ability to work from home, just like the Nick Bloom figure, but they don't really value it more. So if the y-axis here changes to willingness to pay for that amenity, it's a much flatter and noisy relationship. It's very similar in terms of wages are predictive of having flexible schedule here. So it's the high wage workers who have the ability to choose when to allocate their hours, but they also don't value it very much. If anything, it goes the other way. The opposite goes for flexible total number of hours. So this is a little bit surprising because fewer people talk about this. There are amenities for which it is the low wage workers who actually have them. And this is the case with flexible total number of hours. It's those workers who can, sometimes work 20 hours and sometimes work 40 hours. Again, it's not the case that they do that because they value it more. So if we talk about gender differences, this is the only gender graph that I'm going to show. It's pretty clear that this is the empirical CDF of the willingness to pay. Women tend to value flexible location more. They tend to value flexible total number of hours more. It's less clear with flexible schedule, but I want to note that for flexible location, women actually don't have this amenity more than men, even though they value it more. However, for flexible total number of hours, women value it more, and they also are in jobs with flexible total number of hours more. So the story is different between these two here. Okay, so how do we explain these new facts that I just presented? The first kind of fact is the fact that, some amenities are more available for high wage workers rather than low wage workers, but sometimes go the other way, even though across the wage distribution, workers value these amenities similarly. So something about, the skill may be, going on, may change the market here. So we're going to say the market is determined by the skill of the worker because the firm's cost of providing flexibility may actually depend on worker skill. And I'm going to elaborate on this point a little bit more soon, but that's the idea of why we see differential sorting by skill. And then the fact that females workers value two types of flexibility but only have one and not the other means that there may be some interaction and trade-offs going on. It may be possible that it's not possible for firms to provide, if firms are already providing flexible location, they cannot. It's very costly to also provide the ability to choose how many hours to work. So you see iBanking jobs, you can work from home, you can work at any hours, but you cannot work few hours. You have to work a lot of hours. So women may not be in those jobs. So this kind of micro foundation of this, which we don't do, but it can be explained by a production process. Say, why is it that firms' cost depend on workers' skill? Okay. So if workers are high skilled, firms may care about their output instead of their input. And so providing flexibility is not costly. But if firms care about input for low skilled workers, then they need those workers to be present, to be monitored all the time. So providing flexibility is extremely costly. So that's kind of the idea of why this may be the case in kind of motivating our model. And so I mentioned Golden's story about pharmacists, and this is another way to kind of explain, it goes the other way for flexible total number of hours in jobs where workers can substitute with each other. Then it's cheaper for firms to provide flexible total number of hours, like in pharmacy. Okay. So I'm not going to go to the model and go straight to kind of what we see applying our model to the data. So in terms of the interaction, we see that you have to kind of trade off between flexible schedule and hours and flexible location and hours. It's very, very, you usually can only have one or the other. It's very, very difficult to have both, because if you want to have both, you have to pay an extra interaction price, because it's just that much more costly for firms to provide both, conditional on having already providing one. The case is opposite for flexible schedule and location. These two often go hand in hand. So you actually usually trade off between having both or having neither. So jobs with one tends to come with the other, because if firms are already providing you with the ability to work from home, it's not that much costly for them to also allow you to choose your hours. So we see a lot of differential prices of workplace flexibility by skills. And we see that it's not that the high skill workers value flexibility more, but the price that they face is lower. And that's what these are all in log wages, and this is what comes out of our model. And why I'm not showing it here, the model fits extremely well, even though I would say that it's a much more simple model than what Brad and Ben would have, because we just want to really capture this one channel, assuming no other frictions in the labor market. But why is this channel important? Because it's going to have different policy implication here. So the unequal distribution of workplace flexibility, the fact that we conclude that it's not because of differential willingness to pay, means that there's some scope for policies here. It's not that, it's just the people who value it have it more, then there's no reason for policies to intervene. But here it is the fact that there's differential cost for employers to provide these flexibility along the skill distribution. So perhaps we want to subsidize firms when they want to provide these amenities for low skilled workers. The fact that women are more likely to be in jobs with flexible total number of hours, meaning they have to forego the iBanking jobs with long hours, but also better flexibility in other dimensions in order to go to jobs with lower hours, means that compensating differentials really are kind of contributing to the gender earnings gap here, because this means that there's big difference in hours, despite the fact that women also value the other dimensions as well, and they're not in jobs with flexible location and schedule more than men. And so the last thing I want to end with is what happens when policies actually intervene, and it's a feasible thing. During the pandemic, we see that firms' investment in anything in orange here goes down, except for investment in technology that can help with the ability to work from home and providing more flexibility to workers. That's the only type of investment has been going up. So it's possible that there can be policies that help firms lower cost for all workers, so that it's not more costly for employers to provide us at the lower end of the skill distribution. If that happens, what we conclude from our model, our counterfactual, is that the sorting becomes better. We give amenities to the people who really want it. At the same time, even though there's compensating differential, average wages are not really affected. It's not that now that more people are having amenities, they have to pay for it, so wages are lower. That's not the case. It's just better sorting. And in fact, we also see reduction in wage and utility dispersion. So there's less inequality in the labor market when such a policy occurs. Okay. So I'm just going to end there. Thank you. And I look forward to Brad's comments, especially given really related papers.
Thank you, Linh. And next, Bradley is going to provide some discussion remarks.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can get the screen sharing working. Here we go. Okay, are you seeing my slides at this point? Okay, great. I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss these two fascinating papers. They're on a very fast-growing and interesting literature. And so what I wanted to do first is just kind of put these papers into the broader context of sort of what this literature has been finding on wage inequality. So in a paper that's coming out soon, we were able to get sort of micro tax data from the US and from 4 European countries, and just try to sort of do a statistical decomposition of how much of wage inequality is coming from variation within firms, different workers getting paid differently within the same firm, versus variation in wages that's across firms. Different firms pay different average wages. And we found kind of two striking results. I mean, the first is something that I think is well known, which is just that the U.S. is much more unequal than these Western European countries. There's just a whole lot more variation in wages to try to explain across the workers. And then the second is just that there's a pretty robust pattern across all the different countries that firms explain something like 30 to 50% of all wage inequality. So the firm, the employer, seems to play a very large role in what's going on in wage inequality, both in developed countries in Europe and in the US. And once we try to break this down and identify the component that's really due to the firm itself, just that different firms pay different wages to the exact same worker, versus the fact that some firms collect more of those high wage workers and then they pay them a higher wage just from the composition channel. We find that first, both are fairly important. You can explain a good share of this between firm wage inequality with either of the components. But really sorting is substantially more important across these countries. So if we want to try to understand the role of employers and wage inequality, we need to think both about just why do different firms pay different wages to the same workers, but also why is it that certain workers are able to go to the high-paying firms, sort of cluster together at these firms that pay the higher wages. And then one last piece of evidence, this is coming from the paper by Song, Price, Guvin, Bloom, and von Wachter. And they look at over 30 years of US tax data and kind of re-estimate the same sort of firm versus sorting components over time. And what they find is that the sorting component in the US has become much more important over time as a share of the total inequality. The role of these kind of firm premia paying the same worker differently at different firms has, if anything, declined over that period. So the sorting is really an area where you want to focus. So just to think about why these different firms pay differently, there's kind of two explanations that I want to keep in mind, and this kind of sets up the two different papers because each one of them is kind of taking a different angle on this question. The first is the role of compensating differentials and the variation in amenities. So all else equal, a firm with worse work conditions has to pay more to attract, pay more in wages to attract the same number of workers. The existence of good and bad work conditions naturally leads some firms to pay more than others, and that's the compensating differential. But then amenities can also play a role in sorting, and that really showed up and played a big role in Ling's paper. If a firm has relatively good amenities sort of for high wage workers or can more easily provide good amenities if they have high wage workers, then you're going to see more of the high wage workers at those firms with good amenities. And then the other explanation is monopsony and variation in sort of productivity across firms or size across firms. And under the monopsony explanation, firms have upward sloping labor supply curves. They try to suppress the number of workers so that they can basically underpay workers relative to the marginal product that they produce for the firm. And that's your markdown that played a big role in Ben's paper, especially earlier. And so once you have monopsony, you can have that these more productive firms, because they're sort of bidding up along these upward sloping labor supply curves, they end up paying higher wages to otherwise similar workers, even though they're still underpaying workers. It's just that they're operating at a different point on the labor supply curve, and that generates your firm premia. And finally, if the firm has relatively sort of high productivity for the high wage workers, then it'll demand more of those sort of workers with the greater skills, offer them the greater wages, and employ more of them. So then you can kind of get this sorting coming from the monopsony side, where you have the high skill workers clustering together in firms and driving this kind of sorting pattern. So with that kind of background in mind of sort of why the amenities and the monopsony can play such a big role in this inequality in wages across firms, let me first turn to the paper on wage differentials and the price of workplace flexibility that Linh just presented. So this paper focuses on the amenity aspect of the firm's role in wage inequality. It focuses in particular on flexibility as a type of amenity that the firm can offer its workers. She considered three types of flexibility. One is location. Just some firms can make it so that all of the work can be done from home. Sometimes I'll just refer to that as work from home. Another dimension is scheduling. The worker can kind of choose the times of day that they work, as long as the total hours add up per week to the sort of required amount. And then the other is adjustments in the total hours, like from week to week, the worker can choose to be part-time some weeks, full-time other weeks. So these are kind of three different dimensions of flexibility. They surveyed around 1,800 people, gathering information, importantly, on their actual current wages and flexibility that they get in the jobs they have. And they use an algorithm where sort of on each iteration of the survey, they offer the job, the wage and flexibility versus a different wage without flexibility, and kind of iterate and try to pin down exactly what's the price that those workers would be willing to pay to get that flexibility in their jobs. Just to highlight some main empirical findings, the average willingness to pay across those different types of flexibility range from around 13 to 18% of the wage on average. Those who had the flexibility and women in some cases valued it more, and current wages are not strongly related to the willingness to pay. In the model section, then the paper considers the Rosen model. I'll just go quickly through this because we didn't go into as much detail on that today. But the firm endogenously chooses whether or not to provide the binary amenity. There's horizontal differentiation. Some workers really enjoy the amenity more than others, like enjoying having a clean workplace to go to. And firms don't observe those individual tastes, so they can't sort of necessarily set worker-specific compensating differentials and just extract all of the amenity value. And so firms vary in costs of providing the amenity. And you can have in the back of your mind that it's really hard for a coal mine to provide a clean work environment for its workers, whereas a tech company may have an easy time providing a clean workspace to work in. So the workers choosing jobs with the amenity have relatively high taste for it. They sort of sort themselves, and firms offering the amenity have relatively low cost of providing it. So you get kind of two sides of the market that determine the equilibrium. And then this paper extends this to allow that it's cheaper to provide amenities for the high productivity workers. Possibly that's going to come out of the data. And this can induce that the amenity offers at sort of these high productivity firms, the firms that hire the high productivity workers are the ones that offer the amenity. And then you get a sorting effect. Firms with high productivity workers are most likely to provide the amenity. So let me just give kind of three big picture questions for the paper. The first is just, why only focus on the flexibility amenity? There's kind of big literature now coming out that this paper fits into that has really focused on flexibility as an amenity. And I guess a key reason for that is it's something that's fairly easy to manipulate across surveys. It's really hard to sort of randomly offer people a nice boss versus a mean boss or something like that. It's a bit more concrete to offer them work from home versus no work from home. But there are a lot of other reasons why some jobs are nicer than others, like the retirement plans, the stock options, the risk of injury, the layoffs, having a comfortable office, having friendly coworkers, having a good boss, the location, what's the traffic like, the pollution, are you near your family? And so this paper by Mesas, Mullen, Powell, Van Wachter, and Winger, they just tried to survey willingness to pay for a lot of different amenities, maybe a less sophisticated survey design, but their estimates show that the they also find kind of the sorting effect, where it's the workers with the higher willingness to pay that are more likely to sort of have those amenities. And then there's also a small overall role for the flexibility. However, for certain types of workers, it's extremely important. So then you can kind of see a role for the idiosyncrasies across the workers playing such a role. And so I just wanted to suggest one possibility for kind of positioning this paper, which is it seems that the flexibility and the amenity maybe would interact a lot with COVID. That's kind of a reason that a lot of recent papers have focused so much on flexibility. COVID makes it so important to be able to work from home to avoid all the dangers of being in the workplace and catching COVID yourself, as well as the technological improvements that Linh highlighted that make it easier to work from home that were also induced by COVID. That was when you had the spike in investment in these technologies. So the second comment I wanted to ask is just, why do all workers get the same amenity? And the Rosen model, the firms all have to kind of pay the same amenity to all the workers. All the workers go to the same coal mine, so they all get the same disamenity of being in the coal mine. This paper allows the cost of the amenity to depend on the worker productivity, but those workers still get the same amenity. So I just wonder why stop there. In the paper we had earlier this year, firms offer distinct amenities to each worker productivity type. So you could have, firms that have a dangerous, dirty coal mine, but then they have very nice executive suites and private planes for the manager. And so this kind of within firm dimension and the amenities could be an important role for this kind of within firm variation that's ignored if all the workers have to get the same amenity in the firm. And once you do that, you can kind of mechanically match any firm premium sorting patterns just by having all that flexibility of which amenities go to which skill type. So I was just going to suggest you could put on both sides of the market. Let the firm worker productivity pair have a separate amenity cost. Let the amenity taste be kind of worker productivity specific. So then you're flexible in the same way that we were in LMS, but you've gone further in that you've endogenized the amenities. So then it's kind of extending Rosen and extending LMS at the same time to have both mechanisms micro-founding the firm premium and the sorting. And just very quickly, one last comment is just, this is something Ben highlighted earlier, is just that it really matters whether you think these amenities are common information or asymmetric information. If it's common information, then you should get that the firm knows something about the average willingness to pay at least and can kind of subtract that out of the wages. But if it's asymmetric information, you don't know which workers care about the amenities, then you can't subtract it off of the workers who care the most about it. So I just wanted to suggest maybe trying different assumptions on the information. You could say, well, let's suppose that the firms know the average willingness to pay. They just don't know the idiosyncrasies around the average. Let's assume that they already took the average willingness to pay out of the wages as compensating differentials, and then consider adding that back into the wages that you actually observe in the data. That gives you kind of what the inequality in wages would have been if the workers were not having these compensating differentials already kind of subtracted off of their wages when they're in the firms with the good flexibility. So let me turn now to the other paper that falls more in that monopsonies side of the explanation. This is minimum wages and employment composition that Krista presented just a little bit ago. So this paper examines how minimum wage changes impact the hours and tenure of nursing home employees. It has employer-employee shift data from nursing homes during 2016 to 2019. It has information on the workers' hours and their employment type, whether they're salaried or wage CNAs, for example, versus LPNs, and their tenure in the firm. It's combined with external data on minimum wages and local HHIs. One limitation is going to be that there's no data on wages for these workers. I'm not sure if there's maybe some other source where that could be obtained, but I'll mention that later. And then the main findings, the implementation is done with different diffs corrected for multiple cohorts. It finds that the low tenure workers have a reduction in hours and an increase in separations. The high tenure workers have increase in hours and decrease in separations. And there's some substitution from CNAs to those higher credentialed LPMs. And then there's sort of a welfare conclusion that these higher tenure workers are, since they're better, the patients should benefit from this shift in hours toward high tenure workers. So my first question is, did the nursing homes become more productive? So some of the empirical evidence suggested that the firm shifted the composition toward possibly more productive workers, LPMs instead of CNAs, experienced workers instead of new hires. And there's some kind of background theory you could consider here from Asimoglu and Pischke. They showed that the higher minimum wages can incentivize firms to invest in general skills of their workers. So then you could think of tenure becoming even more valuable, having greater payoffs once you're in this world with a higher minimum wage. However, the shift in tenure may not be productivity improving. We can think of another reason, a number of reasons for that. Like seniority rules protect the unproductive older workers. It could be that the new hires actually complement tenured workers. So you kind of need a flow of new hires coming in to help them. Say they perform the less pleasant tasks in the nursing homes. So you kind of need some of them doing those lower enjoyment tasks. And you could maybe have burnout from those high tenure workers now needing to pick up more hours to compensate for the lack of new hires. So this assumption that more tenure means a better nursing home really needs to be validated, I think. So one possibility is to try to find data with measures of nursing home patient outcomes like mortality, hospitalization rates, COVID vaccination and infection rates. I'm sure there's some good administrative data on that now. And maybe you could check if the minimum wage also improved those outcomes as a way to validate that these were kind of productivity improving changes. The second question is just, did these minimum wages induce reallocation across nursing homes? You have this important paper by Dustman, Lindner, and co-authors that found that the minimum wage does in fact induce reallocation from the less productive firms over to the more productive firms. And this could be justified by monopsony with productivity variation. A caveat is those productivity gains could be partially offset due to changes in markdowns. That's the paper that would have been presented today by Simon. So yeah, my slides are slightly out of date, I guess. And one possibility is that all of the effects in this data, you could estimate it for sort of the small versus large nursing homes. Just check the size of the nursing homes in your data, split them into 2 samples, and see, is it those big, presumably higher productivity firms that sort of see these big tenure gains and hours gains and possibly productivity improvements, or is it the smaller nursing homes? And you could also look at how the composition changes, how the sorting kind of changes there, and just try to pin down were there these allocation effects, and how does that sort of inform those welfare relevant results you had at the end of the paper. So just some final thoughts. I think these are both important papers. On the first paper, they have a really nice measuring of willingness to pay for some policy relevant, especially now in the post-COVID world, policy relevant workplace flexibility. And it's along multiple dimensions, which is really nice. It's interesting that you can compare willingness to pay to the actual provision of wages and amenities. That's something that's kind of very cleanly measured in that data. And there's this nice structural extension of the Rosen model to allow for sorting between the productivity and the amenities. And then just some final thoughts on Krista's paper. This is important work measuring hours responses to minimum wages. The debate on whether there are really effects on hours goes back to Card Kruger. So it's sort of an old question that's finally getting clean answers in this modern work. And nursing home workers are a great choice of market for trying to find these effects on the low wage workers. And it happens to have this incredibly rich administrative data required by the ACA that they report this data for measuring the shifts that these workers actually do work. And it provides these very interesting welfare relevant results on which workers benefit from the minimum wage, as well as potentially which patients benefit from the minimum wage. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing these very interesting and exciting papers, and also for the discussants for those remarks. And before turning to the Q&A, I wanted to give presenters a chance to respond to the discussants. So anyone, please feel free to jump in.
I'll just say thank you, Bradley. Those are all really great suggestions, and certainly things that we can make traction on in future drafts. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo Krista, to thank you for the comments, and definitely want to learn more about, the kind of combining the ideas that we have and how that may extend your models in your paper, and see what comes out of that. So definitely looking forward to that.
I had a quick question. Can I just go ahead and unmute? I wasn't sure for Linh, and how do you sort of think of these amenities that sometimes seems actually these amenities are like a lot of workers, especially low wage workers, would think of flexible hours as not a good feature. So when you do your estimation, and those relationships that you were sort of plotting kind of suggest that there's, for some, this is a positive, so it's a negative. Do you allow for that, and how does it show up in your results?
Yeah, no, great question. So a lot of times when people do discrete choice experiments, they actually make an assumption that workers value an option, because like an option should be worth at least 0, because otherwise you're gonna ask things are dominated that you seem to be wasting a question, gaining no information. For us, because we do this in an optimal way, we actually don't make any assumption whether workers value these amenities or not. So we center the prior actually at 0, meaning they can actually somehow want to pay to not have the option to work few hours. But ultimately we find that the bulk of the results are on the positive side. There's a small mass of about 5% of workers who actually do value having the option negatively, less than 5%. And that's, we actually ask a qualitative question, like, do you care about these, these amenities, why or why not? And those workers, their qualitative answer actually just say, I want a commitment device. If I have this option, I'm not going to stick to my plan. I'm not going to work hard enough. I'm not going to earn enough money for my family. So yeah, so there is but very, very small mass of such workers. And I think, your story is probably goes in the sense that like maybe lower jobs, flexible total number of hours come with other disamenities. And maybe that's kind of like what makes people don't like it. But just, we tell them explicitly like, oh, else are equal. So the only thing that they're trading off is between the ability to, to choose how many hours versus not, then they do value it. And that's one advantage of this, kind of discrete choice approach where you have a really controlled environment.
We are reaching the end of the session now, and I just like to thank all our presenters, all of our discussants, our attendees as well for joining us today for these great presentations and discussions. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you in tomorrow's and today's sessions. Thanks so much.